I wish Mary, I can't afford not carry. But you, sweet upon the summer night, it will be her.
Hello, brubs. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. And let me do this, and then we'll get right to reading. I gotta add a title on here. Whoa, don't want to break the spine, buddy. Don't want to break the spine. Here, let me get a title written on it. 15, number 15. Damn, this is the 15th live episode of The Little Friend. The Little Friend. Probably should have turned my heat up when I got home, too. It's cold up here. Daisy, Daisy, you mother fluffer. Alright, is this gonna fucking catch or what? We're just gonna have a lock screen here. Alright, there it goes. Save. Lock screen. Don't care. Alright, let's get to it. Page 186, we pick up. Nights were always too quiet at Harriet's house. The clocks ticked too loud. Beyond the low corona of light from the table lamps, the rooms grew gloomy and cavernous, and the high ceilings receded into what seemed endless shadow. In autumn and winter, when the sun went down at 5, it was worse. But being up, being up and having no one but Allison for company was in some ways worse than being alone. Let me find out where I'm stopping. It always helps when you know where you're stopping, so it doesn't seem like an endless journey. It seems like way too many pages to read in one episode. 7, that'd be 20 pages. No thanks. Not going 20 pages. No way. That's a long section. Maybe I will have to do 20 because I 4 pages. Do I have to read 20? All right, let's go. She lay at the other end of the couch, her face ash blue in the glow of the television, her bare feet resting in Harriet's lap. Idly, Harriet stared down at Allison's feet, which were damp and ham pink, oddly clean considering that Allison walked around barefoot all the time. No wonder Allison and Weenie had got on so well with each other. Weenie had been more human than cat, but Allison was more cat than human. Padding around on her own and ignoring everybody most of the time. Yet perfectly comfortable to curl up by Harriet if she felt like it and stick her feet in Harriet's lap without asking. Allison's feet were very heavy. Suddenly, violently, they twitched. Harriet glanced up and saw Allison's eyelids fluttering. She was dreaming. Quickly, Harriet seized her little toe and wrenched it backward, and Allison yelped and yanked her foot up to her body like a stork. "What are you dreaming about?" demanded Harriet. Allison, red waffle patterns from the sofa stamped upon her cheek, turned her sleep-dulled eyes as if she didn't recognize her. No, not quite, thought Harriet, observing her sister's confusion with keen, clinical detachment. It's like she sees me in something else. What's up? Allison cupped both hands over her eyes. She lay there like that for a moment, very still. And then she stood. Her cheeks were puffy, her eyelids very heavy, her eyelids heavy and inscrutable. "You were dreaming," said Harriet. watching her closely. Allison yawned. Then, rubbing her eyes, she trudged towards the stairs, swaying sleepily as she walked. Wait, cried Harriet. What were you dreaming? Tell me. I can't. What do you mean you can't? You mean you won't? Allison turned and looked at her strangely, Harriet thought. I don't want it to come true, she said, starting upstairs. Don't want what to come true? What I just dreamed. What was it about? Was it about Robin? Allison stopped on the bottom step, then looked back. No, she said. It was about you. That was only 59 seconds, said Harriet, coldly over Pemberton's coughs and splutters. Pem grasped the side of the pool and wiped his eyes with his forearm. Bullshit, he said between gasps. He was maroon in the face, practically the color of Harriet's penny loafers. You were counting too slow. Harriet, with a long, angry whoosh, blew out all the air in her lungs. She breathed deep and hard a dozen times until her head began to whirl. And at the top of the last breath, she dove and kicked off. The way across was easy. On the return trip, though, the chill blue tiger stripes of light, everything thickened and ground down to slow motion. Some kid's arm floating past, dreamy and corpse white. Some kid's leg, tiny white bubbles clinging to the leg hairs, standing on end and rolling away with a slow, foamy kick, as her blood crashed hard in her temples and washed back and crashed hard and washed back and crashed again, like ocean waves pounding on the beach. Up above, hard to imagine it, life cluttered on in brilliant color, at high temperatures and speed. Kids shouting, feet slapping on hot pavement. Kids huddled with soggy towels around their shoulders and slurping on blue popsicles the color of pool water. Bomb pops, they were called. Bomb pops. They were the fad, the favorite treat that year. Shivering penguins on the cold case at the concession stand. Blue lips, blue tongues, shivers and chattering teeth, cold. She burst to the surface with a deafening crack, as if through a pane of glass. The water was shallow, but not quite shallow enough for her to stand in, and she hopped about on tiptoe, gasping as Pemberton, who'd been observing with interest, hit the water smoothly and glided out to her. Before she knew what was happening, he scooped her expertly off her feet, and all of a sudden her ear was against his chest, and she was looking at the nicotine yellow undersides of his teeth. His tawny smell, adult, foreign, and to Harriet, not wholly pleasant, was sharp even over the pool chemicals. Harriet rolled out of his arms, and they fell away from each other. Pemberton on his back with a solid thwack that threw up a sheet of water in, as Harriet splashed to the side and clambered up, rather ostentatiously in her yellow and black striped bathing suit that Libby said made her look like a bumblebee. What, don't you like to be picked up? His tone was lordly, affectionate, as if she was a kitten who'd scratched him. Harriet scowled and kicked the spray of water into his face. Pem ducked. What's the matter? He said teasingly. He knew very well, irritatingly well, how handsome he was, with his superior smile and his marigold-colored hair streaming out behind him in the blue water. Like the laughing merman in Edie's illustrated Tennyson, who would be a merman bold, sitting alone, singing alone, under the sea with a crown of gold. Pemberton let go her ankle and splashed her lightly, then shook his head so that the drops flew. Where's my money? What money? Said Harriet, startled. I taught you how to hyperventilate, didn't I? Just like they tell scuba divers to do in those expensive courses. Yes, but that's all you told me. I practice holding my breath every day. Pem drew back, looking pained. I thought we had a deal, Harriet. No, we don't, said Harriet, who couldn't bear to be teased. Pem laughed. Forget it. I ought to be paying you for lessons. Listen. He dipped his hand in the water, then bobbed up again. Is your sister still bummed out about the cat? That cat? I guess. Why? Said Harriet, rather suspiciously. Pem's interest in Allison made no sense to her. She ought to get a dog. Dogs can learn tricks, but you can't teach a cat to do anything. That they don't give a shit. Neither does she. Pemberton laughed. Well, then I think a puppy is just what she needs, he said. There's a notice in the clubhouse about some chow chow puppies for sale. She'd rather have a cat. Has she ever had a dog? No. Well, then she doesn't know what she's missing. Cats look like they know what's going on, but all they do is sit around and stare. Not Weenie. He was a genius. Sure he was. No, really. He understood every word we said, and he tried to talk to us. Ellison worked with him all the time. He did the best he could, but his mouth was just too different, and the sounds didn't come out right. I bet they didn't, said Pemberton, rolling over to float on his back. His eyes were the same bright blue as the pool water. He did learn a few words. Yeah, like what? Like nose? Nose? That's a weird word to teach him, said Pemberton idly, looking up at the sky, his yellow hair spread out like a fan of the water. She wanted to start with names of things she could point to, like Miss Sullivan with Helen Keller. She'd touch Weenie's nose and say, nose, that's your nose. You got a nose. Then she'd touch her own nose, then his again, back and forth. She must not have had much to do. Well, she didn't really. They'd sit there all afternoon, and after a while, all Allison had to do was touch her nose, and Weenie would reach up like this with his paw and nose. And I'm not kidding, she said over Pendleton's loud derision. No, really, he would make a weird little meow like he was trying to say nose. Pemberton rolled over on his stomach and resurfaced with a splash. Come on, it's true, asked Allison. Pem looked bored. Just because he made a noise, yes, but it wasn't any old noise. She cleared her throat and tried to imitate the sound. You don't expect me to believe that. She has it on tape. Allison recorded a bunch of tapes of him. Most of it just sounds like plain old meows, but if you listen hard, you can really hear him saying a couple of words in there. Harriet, you crack me up. It's the truth. Ask Ida Rue, and he could tell time, too. Every afternoon at 2:45 on the dot, he scratched on the back door for Ida to let him out so he could meet Allison's bus. Pemberton bobbed under the water to slick his hair back, then pinched his nostrils shut and blew noisily to clear his ears. He said cheerfully, I don't know. She never has liked me. She was always mean to me when I came over to play with Robin, even when I was in kindergarten. She would pick a switch off of one of those bushes you have out back there and chase my little ass all over the yard. She doesn't like Healy either. Pemberton sneezed and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. What's going on with you and Healy anyways? Is he not your boyfriend anymore? Harriet was horrified. He never was my boyfriend. That's not what he says. Harriet kept her mouth shut. Healy got provoked and shouted out things he didn't mean when Pemberton pulled this trick, but she wasn't going to fall for it. Healy's mother, Martha Price Hall, gone to high school with Harriet's mother, was notorious for spoiling her sons rotten. She adored them frantically and allowed them to do exactly as they pleased, never mind what their father had to say. And though it was too soon to tell with Healy, this indulgence was thought to be the reason why Pemberton had turned out so disappointingly. Her fond, child-rearing methods were legend. Grandmothers and mothers-in-law always Martha Price and her boys as a cautionary example to doting young mothers of the heavy grievance someday to fall if, for instance, one allowed one's child for 3 whole years to refuse all food but chocolate pie, as Pemberton had been famously permitted to do. From the ages of 4 to 7, Pemberton had eaten no food but chocolate pie. Moreover, it was stressed grimly, a special kind of chocolate pie, which called for condensed milk and all sorts of costly ingredients, and which doting Martha Price had been forced to rise at 6 a.m. daily in order to bake. The aunts still talked about an occasion when Pem, a guest of Robin's, had refused lunch at Libby's house, beating on the table with his fist like King Henry VIII demanding chocolate pie. Can you imagine? Mama, give me chocolate pie. I would have given him a good whipping. That Pemberton had grown to adulthood enjoying a full head of teeth was a miracle, but his lack of industry and gainful employment were fully explainable, all felt by this early catastrophe. It was often speculated what a bitter embarrassment Pem's father must find his eldest son, since he was the headmaster of Alexandria Academy, and disciplining young people was his job. Mr. Hall was not the shouting, red-faced ex-athlete customary at private academies like Alexandria. He was not even a coach. He taught science to junior high school students and spent the rest of his time in his office with the door shut, reading books on aeronautical engineering. Mr. Hall had the school under tight control, and students were terrified by his silences. His wife undercut his authority at home, and he had a tough time keeping order with his own boys. Pemberton, in particular, who was always joking and smirking and making rabbit ears behind his father's head when the group photographs were taken. Parents sympathized with Mr. Hall. It was clear to everyone that nothing short of knocking the boy unconscious was going to shut him up. And though the withering way he barked at Pemberton on public occasions made everyone in the room nervous, Pem himself seemed not bothered by it in the and kept right up with the easy wisecracks and smart remarks. But though Martha Hall did not mind if her sons ran all over town, grew their hair past their shoulders, drank wine with dinner, or ate dessert for breakfast, a few rules in the household were inviolable. Pemberton, not Pemberton. Pemberton, though 20, was not allowed to smoke in his mother's presence, and Healy, of course, not at all. Loud rock and roll music on the hi-fi was forbidden, though when his parents were out, Pemberton and his friends blasted The Who and the Rolling Stones across the entire neighborhood. To Charlotte's befuddlement, Mrs. Fountain's complaints, and Edie's volcanic rage, and while neither parent could now stop Pemberton from going very pleased, Healy was forbidden at all times. Pine Hill, a bad section of town with pawn shops and juke joints, and the pool hall. It was the pool hall where Healy, still in his sulk over Harriet, now found himself. He had parked his bicycle down the street in the alley by the city hall in case his mother or father happened to drive by. Now he stood morosely crunching barbecued potato chips, which were sold along with cigarettes and gum at the dusty counter, and browsing through the comic books at the rack by the door. Though the pool hall was only a block or two from the town square and had no liquor license, it was nonetheless the roughest place in Alexandria, worse even than the Black Door or the Esquire Lounge over in Pine Hill. Dope was said to be sold at the pool hall. Gambling was rampant. It was the site of numerous shootings and slashings and mysterious fires, poorly lit with cinder block walls painted prison green and fluorescent tubes flickering on the foam paneling ceiling. It was on this afternoon fairly empty. Of the 6 tables, only 2 were in use, and a couple of country boys with slicked hair and snap front denim shirts played a subdued game of pinball in the back. Though the pool hall's mildewy, depraved atmosphere appealed to Healy's sense of desperation, he did not know how to play pool, and he was scared to loiter near the tables and watch. But he felt invigorated just to stand by the door unnoticed, munching his barbecued potato chips and breathing the same perilous ozone of corruption. What drew Healy to the pool hall were the comic books. Their selection was the best in town. The drugstore carried Richie Rich, and Betty and Veronica, the big star grocery, had all these and Superman, too, on a rack situated uncomfortably by the rotisserie chicken so that Healy couldn't browse too long without thoroughly roasting his ass. But the pool hall had Sergeant Rock and Weird War Tales and GI Combat, real soldiers killing real gooks. They had Rima, the jungle girl, in her panther fur bathing suit. Best of all, they had a rich selection of horror comics, werewolves, premature burials, drooling carrions, shuffling forth from the graveyard, all of which were to Healy of unbelievably riveting interest. Weird mystery tales and House of Secrets, The Witching Hour, and The Spectre's Notebook, and Forbidden Tales of the Dark Mansion. He had not been aware that such galvanizing reading matter existed, much less that it was available for him, Healy, to purchase in his own town. Until one afternoon, when he had been forced to stay after school, he had discovered in an empty desk a copy of Secrets of Sinister House. On its cover was a picture of a crippled girl in a creepy old house, screaming and frantically trying to roll her wheelchair away from a giant cobra. Inside, the crippled girl perished in a froth of convulsions. And there was more: vampires, gouged eyes, fratricides. Healy was enthralled. He read it 5 or 6 times from cover to cover and then took it home and read it some more until he knew it backwards and forward by heart. Every single story: Satan's Roommate, Come Share My Coffin, Transylvania Travel Agency. It was without question the greatest comic book he had ever seen. He believed it to be one of a kind, some marvelous fluke of nature unobtainable, and he was beside himself when some weeks later he saw a kid at school named Barney Landreth reading one quite similar, this one called Black Magic, with a picture of a mummy strangling an archaeologist on the cover. He pleaded with Benny, who was a grade older and mean, to sell the comic to him, and then, when that didn't work, he offered to pay Benny $2 and then $3 if Benny would only let him look at the comic for a minute. Just 1 minute. Go down to the pool hall and buy your own, Benny had said, rolling up the comic book and slapping Healy across the side of the head. That was 2 years ago. Now, horror comic books were all that got Healy through certain difficult stretches of life: chicken pox, boring car trips, Camp Lake DeSelby. Because of his limited funds and the strict interdiction against the pool hall, his expeditions to purchase them were infrequent. Once a month perhaps, and much anticipated. The fat man at the cash register didn't seem to mind that Healy stood around the rack for so long. In fact, he hardly noticed Healy at all, which was just as well, as Healy sometimes stood studying the comics for hours in order to make the wisest possible selection. He had come up here to get his mind off Harriet, but he only had 35 cents after the potato chips, and the comic books were 25 cents each. Half-heartedly, he leafed through a story in Dark Mansions called Demon at the Door. Arg! I have unleashed a loathsome evil to haunt this land until sunrise. Blah. But his eyes kept straying to the Charles Atlas bodybuilding advertisement on the page opposite. Take a good, honest look at yourself. Do you have the dynamic tension that women admire? Or are you a skinny, scrawny, 97-pound, half-alive weakling? Healy was not sure how much he weighed, but 97 pounds sounded like a lot. Glumly, he studied the Before cartoon, a scarecrow basically, and wondered if he should send for the information, or if it was a ripoff, like the X-ray specs were advertised as enabling one to see through flesh and walls in women's clothing. They had cost $1.98 plus 35 cents for postage, and they had taken forever to arrive, and when they finally came, they were nothing more than a pair of plastic frames with 2 sets of cardboard inserts, one with a cartoon drawing of a hand through which you could see the bones, the other with a cartoon of a sexy secretary in a see-through dress with a black bikini underneath. A shadow fell over Healy. He glanced up to see 2 figures with their backs half to him, who had drifted from the pool tables to the comic book rack to converse privately. Healy recognized one of them, Catfish de Bienville, who was a slumlord, something of a local celebrity. He wore his rust-red hair and a giant afro and drove a custom Gran Torino with tinted windows. Healy often saw him at the pool hall, also standing around talking to people outside the car wash on summer evenings. Though his features were like a black man's, he was not actually dark in color. His eyes were blue and his skin was freckled and as white as Healy's, but he was mostly recognizable around town for his clothes: silk shirts, bell-bottom pants, belt buckles the size of salad plates. People said he bought them from Lansky Brothers in Memphis, where Elvis was said to shop. Now, as hot as it was, he wore a red corduroy smoking jacket, white flares, and red patent leather platform loafers. It was not Catfish who had spoken, however, but the other, underfed, tough, with bitten fingernails. He was little more than a teenager, not too tall or too clean, with sharp cheekbones and lank hippie hair parted in the middle. But there was a scruffy, mean-edged coolness about him, like a rock star, and he held himself erect like he was somebody important, though he obviously wasn't. "Where do you get playing money?" Catfish was whispering to him. "Disability, I reckon," said the hippie-haired kid, glancing up. His eyes were a startling silvery blue, and there was something staring and rather fixed about them. They seemed to be talking about poor Carl Odom, who was racking balls across the room and offering to take on any comers for any who wished to lose. Carl, widowed with what seemed like about 9 or 10 squalid little children, was only about 30, but looked twice as old. face and neck ruined with sunburn, his pale eyes pink around the rims. He'd lost a few fingers in an accident down at the egg packing plant not long after his death. Now he was drunk and bragging how he could whip anybody in the room, fingers or not. "Here's my bridge," he said, holding up his mutilated hand. "This here's all I need." Dirt etched the lines of his palm and the nails of the only two fingers remaining, the pointer and the thumb. Odom was addressing these remarks to a guy beside him on the table, a gigantic bearded guy, a bear of a guy who wore a brown coverall with a ragged hole cut in the breast where the name tag should have been. He wasn't paying any attention to Odom. His eyes were fixed upon the table. Long dark hair, streaked with gray, straggled down past his shoulders. He was very large and awkward somehow about the shoulders, as if his arms did not fit comfortably into the sockets. They hung stiffly with slightly crooked elbows, and the palms falling slack the way a bear's arms might hang if a bear decided to rear up on its hind legs. Healy couldn't stop staring at him. The bushy black beard and the brown jumpsuit made him look like some kind of crazy South American dictator. "Anything pertaining to pool or the playing of pool," Odom was saying. "It's what I guess you'd have to call second nature." "Well, some of us has gifts that way," said the big guy in the brown jumpsuit in a deep but not unpleasant voice. As he said this, he glanced up, and Healy saw with a jolt that one of his eyes was all creepy. A milky walleye rolled out to the side of his head. Much closer, only a few feet from where Healy stood, the tough-looking kid tossed his hair out of his face and said tensely to Catfish, $20 a pop every time he loses." Deftly, with the other hand, he shook a cigarette from the pack in a tricky flick like he was throwing dice, and Healy noted with interest that despite the practiced cool of the gesture, his hands trembled like an old person's. Then he leaned forward and whispered something in Catfish's ear. Catfish laughed aloud. "Lose my yellow ass," he said in an easy, graceful movement. He spun and sauntered off to the pinball machines in the back. The tough kid lit his cigarette and gazed out across the room, his eyes burning pale and silvery out of his sunburnt face. Gave Healy a little shiver as they passed over him without seeing him. Wild-looking eyes, with a lot of light in them, that reminded Healy of old pictures he'd seen of Confederate soldier boys. Across the room, over by the pool table, the bearded man in the brown jumpsuit had only the one good eye, but it shone with something of the same silvery light. Healy, studying them over the top of his comic book, noted a squeak of family resemblance between the two of them. Though they were very different at first glance, the bearded man was older and much heavier than the kid. Still, they had the same long dark hair and sunburnt complexion, the same fixity of eye and stiffness of neck, a similar tight-mouthed way of talking, as if to conceal bad teeth. "How much you plan on taking him for?" said Catfish, presently, sliding back to his pal side. The kid cackled, and at the crack in his laugh, Healy nearly dropped the comic book. He'd had plenty of time to get used to that high-pitched, derisive laughter. It had rung at his back from the creek bridge for a long, long time as he stumbled through the undergrowth, the echoes of the gunshots singing off the bluffs. It was him, without the cowboy hat. That was why Healy hadn't recognized him. As the blood rushed to his face, he stared down furiously at his comic book, at the gasping girl who clutched Johnny Perril's shoulder. "Johnny, that figure of wax, it moved." "Odom ain't a bad player, Danny," Catfish was saying quietly. "Fingers or no fingers. He could beat Farish when he's sober, but not when he's drunk." Twin light bulbs popped on in Healy's head. Danny, Farish, being shot at by rednecks was exciting enough, but being shot at by the Ratliffs was something else. He could not wait to get home and tell Harriet about all this. Could this bearded Sasquatch actually be the fabled Farish? There was only one Farish that Healy had ever heard of in Alexandria or anywhere else. With difficulty, Healy forced himself to look down at his comic. He had never seen Farish Ratliff up close, only at a distance. Pointing out from a moving car or pictured blurrily in the local paper, but he had heard stories about him all his life. At one time, Farish Ratliff had been the notorious crook in Alexandria, masterminding a family gang which incorporated every kind of burglary and petty theft imaginable. He had also written and distributed a number of educational pamphlets over the years, featuring such titles as Your Money or Your Life, A Protest Against the Federal Income Tax, Rebel Pride, Answering the Critics, and Not My Daughter. All this had stopped, however, with an incident with a bulldozer a few years back. Healy didn't know why Farish had decided to steal the bulldozer. The newspaper had said that the foreman discovered it missing from a construction site out behind the Party Ice Company. And then the next thing anyone knew, Farish was spotted tearing down the highway on it. He wouldn't pull over when signaled, but turned and took defensive action with the bulldozer shovel. Oh, man. Oh. Then, when the cops opened fire, he bolted across the cow pasture, tearing down a barbed wire fence, scattering panicked cattle in all directions until he managed to tip the bulldozer into a ditch. As they ran across the pasture, shouting for Farish to exit the vehicle with his hands above his head, they stopped dead in their tracks to see the distant figure of Farish in the bulldozer's cab stick a .22 to his temple and fire. There had been a picture in the paper of a cop named Jackie Sparks, looking genuinely shaken, standing over the body out there in the cow pasture as he shouted instructions to the ambulance attendants. Though it was a mystery why Farish had stolen the bulldozer in the first place, the real mystery was why Farish had shot himself. Some people claimed that it was because he was afraid of going back to prison, but others said no. Prison was nothing to a man like Farish. The offense wasn't that serious, and he would have gotten out again in a year or two. The bullet wound was grave, and Farish had very nearly died of it. He'd made news again when he awakened asking for mashed potatoes from what the doctors believed was a vegetative state. When he was released from the hospital, legally blind in his right eye, he was sent down to the state mental farm at Whitfield on an insanity plea, a measure perhaps not unjustified. Since his release from the mental hospital, Farish was in several aspects an altered man. It wasn't just the eye. People said he had stopped drinking as far as anyone knew. He no longer broke into gas stations or stole cars and chainsaws from people's garage, though his younger brothers took up the slack as far as such activities were concerned. His racial concerns had also slipped from the forefront. No more did he stand on the sidewalk in front of the public school handing out his homemade pamphlets decrying school integration. He ran a taxidermy business, and along with his disability checks and his proceeds from stuffing deer heads and bass for local hunters, he had become a fairly law-abiding citizen, or so it was said. And now here he was, Farish Ratliff in the flesh, twice in the same week, if you counted the bridge. The only Ratliffs Healy had occasion to see in his own part of town were Curtis, who roamed freely over greater Alexandria, shooting his squirt gun at passing cars, and brother Eugene, a preacher of some sort. This Eugene was occasionally to be seen preaching on the town square, or more frequently reeling in the vaporous heat off the highway as he shouted above the Pentecost and shook his fist at the traffic. Though Farish was said to be not quite right in the head since he'd shot himself, Eugene, Healy had heard his father say, was frankly demented. He ate red clay from people's yards and fell out on the sidewalk in fits where he heard the voice of God in thunder. Catfish was having a quiet word with a group of middle-aged men at the table beside Odom's. One of them, a fat man in a yellow sports shirt with piggy, suspicious eyes like raisins sunk in dough, glanced over at Farish and Odom and then regally strode to the other side of the table and sank a low ball. Without glancing at Catfish, he reached carefully for his back pocket, and after half a beat, one of the three spectators standing behind him did the same. "Hey," Danny Ratliff said across the room to Odom, "hold your horses. If it's for money now, Farish has the next game." Farish hawked with a loud, retching noise and shifted his weight to the other foot. Old Farish only got him the one eye now, said Catfish, sliding over and slapping Farish on the back. Watch it, Farish said, rather menacingly, with an angry jerk of his head that did not seem entirely show. Catfish suavely leaned across the table and offered his hand to Odom. Name of Catfish D. Bienville, he said. Odom irritably waved him away. I know who you are. Ferris slid a couple of quarters into the metal slide and jerked it hard. The balls chunked loose from the undercarriage. I beat this blind man a time or two. I'll shoot pool with any man in here that can see, said Odom, staggering back, righting himself by jabbing his cue to the floor. Why don't you step on back and quit crowding me, he snapped at Catfish, who had slipped behind him again. Yes, you. Catfish leaned to whisper something in his ear. Slowly, Odom's white blonde eyebrows pulled together in a befuddlement. Don't like to play for money, Odom, Ferris said derisively after a slight pause as he reached beneath the table and began to rack the balls. You a deacon over at the Baptist church? Nah, said Odom. The greedy thought planted in his ear by Catfish was beginning to work its way across his sunburnt face, as visible as a cloud moving across empty sky. Diddy, said a small, acid voice from the doorway. It was LaSharon Odom. Her scrawny hip was thrown to the side in what was to Healy a disgustingly adult-looking posture. Across it was straddled a baby just as dirty as she was, their mouths circled with orange rings from popsicles or Fanta. Well, look at here, said Catfish stagily. Diddy, you said come get you when the big hand was on the three. $100, said Farish in the silence that followed. Take it or leave it. Odom twisted the chalk on his cue and hitched up a pair of imaginary shirt sleeves. Then he said abruptly, without looking at his daughter, Diddy's not ready to go yet, sugar. Here's y'all a dime apiece. Run look at the funny books. Diddy, you said remind you. I said run along. Your break, he said to Farish. I racked. I know it, said Odom, flicking his hand. Go on. I'm giving it to you. Farish slumped forward, his weight on the table. He looked down the cue with his good eye, straight at Healy, and his gaze was as cold as if he was looking down the barrel of a gun. Crack! The balls spun apart. Odom walked to the opposite side and studied the table for several moments. Then he popped his neck quickly by swinging it to the side and leaned down to make his shot. Catfish slipped in amongst the men who drifted from the pinball machines and the adjoining tables to watch. Inconspicuously, he whispered something to the man in the yellow shirt just as Odom made a showy leap shot which sank not one but two striped balls. Whoops and cheers. Catfish drifted back to Danny's side in the confused conversation from the spectators. Odom can hold the table all day, he whispered, as long as they stick to 8-ball. Farish can run it just as good when he gets going. Odom rolled in another combination, a delicate shot where the cue ball hit a solid ball that tipped another one into a pocket. More cheers. Who's in, Danny said. Them two by the pinball? Not interested, said Catfish, glancing casually over his shoulder and above Healy's head as he reached in the watch pocket of his leather vest and palmed a small metal object about the size and shape of a golf tee. In the instant before his beringed fingers closed over it, Healy saw that it was a bronze figurine of a naked lady with high-heeled shoes and a big afro hairdo. Why not? Who are they? Just a couple of good Christian boys, said Catfish as Odom sank an easy ball into a side pocket. He unscrewed the lady's head from her body and flicked it into the jacket pocket with his thumb. Look at this. I can just use this to hold the page down. Them other group, he rolled his eyes at the man in the yellow sports shirt and his fat friends, is passing through from Texas. Catfish glanced around casually and then, turning as if to sneeze, he raised the vial and took a quick, covert sniff. Work a shrimping boat, he said, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his smoking jacket, his gaze passing blankly across the comic book rack and over the top of Healy's head as he palmed the vial to Danny. Danny sniffed loudly and pinched his nostrils shut. Water welled in his eyes. God Almighty, he said. Odom smacked in another ball. Amidst the hoots of the men from the shrimping boat, Farish glared down at the table. The pool cue balanced horizontally along the back of his neck and his elbows slung over either side. Paws dangling. Catfish stepped backward with a loose, comical little dance movement. He seemed exhilarated all of a sudden. Mr. Farish, he said gaily across the room, his tone mimicking that of a popular black comedian on television, has apprised himself of the situation. Healy was excited and so confused that his head felt as though it might pop. The significance of the vial had escaped him, but Catfish's bad language and suspicious manner had not. And though Healy was not sure exactly what was going on, he knew it was gambling and that it was against the law, just as it was against the law to shoot guns off a bridge, even if nobody got killed. His ears burned. They always got red when he was excited. He hoped nobody noticed. Casually, he replaced the comic he was looking at and took a new one from the rack, Secrets of Sinister House. A skeleton seated in a witness chair flung out a fleshless arm at the spectators as a ghostly attorney boomed. And now my witness, who was the victim, will point out the man who killed him. Come on, kick it, shouted Odom unexpectedly as the 8-ball zinged across the baize, ricocheted, and clunked into the corner pocket opposite. In the pan that followed, Odom removed a small bottle of whiskey from his back pocket and had a long, thirsty pull from it. Let's see that $100, Ratliff. I'm good for it, and I'm good for another one, too, snapped Farish as the balls fell from the undercarriage, and he began to rack them up again. Winner's break. Odom shrugged and squinted down the cue, nose wrinkled, upper lip bearing his rabbity front teeth, then smashed in a break that not only left the cue ball still spinning where it had hit the rack of balls, but shot the 8-ball in a corner pocket. The men who worked on the shrimping boat hooted and clapped. They looked like guys who felt they were on to a good thing. Catfish lolloped over to them jauntily, knees loose, chin high to confer over the finances. That's the fastest money you ever lost, Danny called across the room. Healy became aware that LaSharon Odom was standing right behind him, not because she said anything, but because the baby had had a bad cold and breathed with wet, repellent wheezes. Get away from me, he muttered, edging a little to the side. Shyly, she moved after him, obtruding into the corner of his vision. Let me borrow a quarter. The wheedling hopelessness of her voice revolted him, even more than the baby's snotty breathing. Pointedly, he turned his back. Ferris, to the rolled eyes of the men from the shrimping boat, was reaching again in the undercarriage. Odom grabbed his jaw between both hands and cracked his neck to the left, and then right. Snick. Still ain't had enough? Oh, all right now, Catfish crooned along to the jukebox, popping his fingers. Baby, what I say? What's all this trash on the music box? Snarled Farish, dropping the balls in an angry clatter. Catfish teasingly undulated his meager hips. Loosen up, Farish. Go on, said Healy to LaSharon, who had sidled up again, nearly touching him. I don't want your booger breath. He was so sickened by her nearness that he said this louder than he meant to, and he froze when Odom's unfocused gaze swung vaguely in their direction. Farish looked up, too, and his good eye pinned Healy like a thrown knife. Odom took a deep, drunken breath and put down the pool cue. You all see that little old gal standing yonder? He said melodramatically to Farish and company. It's against me to tell you this, but that little gal does the work of a grown woman. Catfish and Danny Ratliff exchanged a quick glance of alarm. I ask you, where would you find a sweet little old girl like this that looks after the house and looks after the little ones and puts food on the table and totes and fetches and goes without so's her poor old Diddy can have? I mean, that's pretty, what's that word? Diddy and little kids. I wouldn't want any food she put on the table, thought Healy. Young guns today all think they have to have, Ferris said flatly. They would do just as well to be like yourn and go without. When me and my brothers and sisters were coming up, we didn't even have us an icebox, said Odom in a quaver. He was getting good and wound up. All the summer long I had to chop cotton out in the fields. I've chopped my share of cotton too. And my mama, I'm telling you, she worked these fields like a man. Me, I couldn't go to school. Mama and daddy, they needed me at home. No, we never had a thing, but if I had money, it's nothing in the world I wouldn't buy those little ones over there. They know old Diddy'd rather give it to them than have it himself. Don't you all know that? His unfocused eyes wavered from LaSharon and the baby to Healy himself. I said, don't you all know that? He repeated in an amplified and pleasant tone. He was staring straight at Healy. Healy was shocked. Geez, he thought, is the old coot so drunk he don't know I'm not his kid? He stared back with his mouth open. Yes, Diddy, LaSharon whispered, just audible. Odom's red-rimmed eyes softened and moved unsteadily to his daughter, and the moist, self-pitying tremor of his lip made Healy more uneasy than anything else he had seen that afternoon. Hear that? Hear that, little old gal? Come here and hug old Diddy around the neck, he said, dashing away a tear with his knuckle. LaSharon hoisted the baby on her bony hip and went slowly to him. Something about the possessiveness of Odom's embrace and the vacant way she accepted it like a miserable old dog accepting the touch of its owner disgusted Healy, but scared him a little bit too. This little gal loves her old Diddy, don't she? He pressed her to his shirt front with tears in his eyes. Healy was gratified to see by the way they rolled their eyes at each other that Catfish and Danny Ratliff was just as disgusted by Odom's slop as he was. She knows her Diddy's a poor man. She don't have to have a bunch of old toys and candy and fancy clothes. And why should she, said Farish abruptly. Odom, intoxicated by the sound of his own voice, turned foggily and puckered his brow. Yeah, you heard right. Why should she have all that mess? Why should any of them have it? We didn't have anything when we was coming up, did we? A slow wave of astonishment illumined Odom's face. Nah, brother, he cried gaily. Was we ashamed of being poor? Was we too good to work? What's good enough for us is good enough for her, ain't it? Darn right. Who says that kids should grow up to think they're better than their own parents? The federal government, that's who. Why do you reckon government sticks its nose into a man's home and doles out all these food stamps and vaccinations and liberal education on a silver platter? I'll sure tell you why. It's so they can brainwash kids to think they gotta have more than their folks did and look down on what they come from and raise themselves above their own flesh and blood. I don't know about you, sir, but my daddy never gave me a thing for free. Low murmurs of approval from all over the pool. Nope, said Odom, wagging his head mournfully. Mama and Diddy never give me nothing. I worked for it all, everything I have. Farish nodded curtly at LaSharon and the baby. So tell me this, why should she have what we didn't? It's the God's own truth. Leave Diddy alone, sugar, Odom said to his daughter, who was tugging listlessly at his pant legs. Diddy, please, let's go. Diddy ain't ready to leave yet, sugar. But Diddy, you said, reminds you that the Chevrolet place closes at 6. Catfish, with an expression of rather strained goodwill, slid over to speak quietly with the men from the shrimp boat, one of whom had just glanced at his wristwatch. By then, Odom reached into the front pocket of his filthy jeans and dug around for a moment or two and pulled out the biggest wad of cash that Healy had ever seen. This got everyone's attention right away. Odom tossed the roll of bills on the table. What's left of my insurance settlement, he said, nodding at the money with drunken piety. From this hand here, going to go to the Chevrolet place and pay that minty breath bastard Roy Dial. He come and taken my damn car from out in front, my. That's how they operate, said Ferris soberly. These bastards from the tax commission and the finance company and the sheriff's department, they come right up a man's property and take what they feel like whenever they feel like it. And, said Odom, raising his voice, I'm going to go down there directly and get it back with this. None of my business, but you art not drop all that cash money on a car. What? Said Odom belligerently, staggering back. The money on the green bays lay in a yellow circle of light. Ferris raised a grubby paw. I'm saying that if you purchase your vehicle above the table, so-called, from a slick weasel like Dial, not only is Dial robbing you outright with the financing, but the state and federal government are right in line for their cut, too. I done spoke out many and many a times against the sales tax. The sales tax is unconstitutional. I can point my finger right where in the Constitution of this nation it says so. Come on, Diddy, said LeSharon faintly, plucking away gamely at Odom's pants leg. Diddy, please, let's go. Odom was gathering up his money. He did not seem to have absorbed really the gist of Farish's little talk. No, sir. He was breathing hard. That man can't take what belongs to me. I'm going to go right down to Dial Chevrolet and sling this right in his face. He slapped the bills against the pool table, and I'm going to say to him, I'm going to say, give me back my vehicle, you minty breath bastard. Laboriously, he stuffed the bills into the right pocket of his jeans as he fished for a quarter in the left. But first, I got this 402 more of yours. Say I can kick your ass one more time at 8-ball. Danny Ratliff, who had been pacing in a tight circle by the Coke machine, exhaled audibly. Them's high stakes, said Farish impassively. My break? Yours, said Odom, with a drunken, magnanimous wave. Farish, with absolutely no expression on his face, reached into his hip pocket and retrieved a large black wallet attached by a chain to a belt loop of his coveralls. With a bank teller's swift professionalism, he counted off $600 in 20s and laid them down upon the table. That's a lot of cash, my friend, said Odom. Friend? Ferris laughed harshly. I only got 2 friends. My 2 best friends. He held up the wallet, still thick with bills for inspection. See this? This here's my first friend, and he's always right here in my hip pocket. I got me a second best friend that stays with me, too, and that friend is a .22 pistol. Diddy, said LeSharon, hopelessly giving her father's pants leg one more tug. Please, what are you staring at, you little shit? Healy jumped. Danny Ratliff, only a foot away, was towering over him, eyes horribly alight. Answer me when I talk to you, you little shit. Everyone was looking at him. Catfish, Odom, Farish, the men from the shrimp boat, and the fat guy at the cash register. As if from a great distance he heard LeSharon Odom say in her clear, acidic voice, he's just looking at the funny books with me, Diddy. Is that true? Is it? Healy, too petrified to speak, nodded. What's your name? This gruffly from across the room. Healy glanced over and saw Ferris Ratliff's good eye trained on him like a power drill. Healy Hall, said Healy without thinking, and then aghast clasped the hand over his mouth. Ferris chuckled dryly. That's the spirit boy, he said, screwing a square of blue chalk on the end of his cue, his good eyes still fixed on Healy. Never tell nothing that you ain't made to tell. Oh, I know who this little shit weasel is, Danny Ratliff said to his big brother, and then tossed his chin at Healy. Say you called Hall? Yes, sir, said Healy miserably. Danny let out a high, harsh laugh. Yes, sir, listen to that. Don't you sir me, you little. Nothing wrong with the boy having manners, said Ferris rather sharply. Hall, your name is? Yes, sir. He's kin to that Hall boy drives an old Cadillac convertible, said Danny to Ferris. Diddy, said LeSharon Odom loudly in the tense silence. Diddy, can me and Rusty go look at the funny books? Odom gave her a pat on the bottom. Run along, sugar. Look a here, he said drunkenly to Ferris, stabbing the butt of his cue on the floor for emphasis. We're going to play this game. Let's go on and play it. I got to get going. But Ferris, much to Healy's relief, had already begun to rack the balls. After one last long stare in his direction, Healy concentrated every ounce of his attention on the comic book. The letters jumped slightly with his heartbeat. Don't look up, he told himself, even for a second. His hands were trembling and his face burned so red that he felt it was drawing the attention of everyone in the room. As a fire would, Ferris made the break, and it was a resounding one, so loud that Healy flinched. A ball clunked into a pocket, followed 4 or 5 long, rolling seconds later by another. The men from the shrimping boat went silent. Somebody was smoking a cigar, and the stink made Healy's head ache, as did the garish ink jittering across the newsprint in front of him. A long silence, clunk, another long silence. Very, very quietly, Healy began to slink toward the door. Clunk, clunk. The stillness practically vibrated with tension. Jesus, someone cried. You said the bastard couldn't see. Confusion. Healy was past the cash register and nearly out the door when a hand shot out and grabbed him by the back of his shirt, and he found himself blinking into the face of the bald, bull-faced cashier. With horror, he realized that he was still clutching Secrets of Sinister House, which he had not yet paid for. Frantically, he dug in the front pocket of his shorts, but the cashier was not interested in him, was not even looking at him, though he had him by the shirt firmly enough. He was interested in what was going on at the pool table. Healy dropped a quarter and a dime on the counter, and as soon as the guy let go his shirt, shot out the door. The afternoon sun hurt his eyes after the darkness of the pool hall. He broke into a run down the sidewalk, his vision so light-dazzled that he was hardly able to see where he was going. There was no pedestrians on the square, too late in the afternoon, and only a few parked cars. Bicycle, where was it? He ran past the post office, past the Masonic Temple, and was halfway down Main Street before he remembered that he'd left it all the way back in the alley behind the city hall. He turned and ran back, panting. The alley was slippery with moss and very dim. Once, when Healy was younger, he had ducked into it without paying attention when he was where he was going, and stumbled headlong over the shadowy, supine form of a tramp, an odorous heap of rags, stretched out nearly half the alley's length. When Healy fell smack over him, he sprang up, cursing, and grabbed Healy by the ankle. Healy had screamed as if boiling gasoline was being poured over him in his agony to escape. He'd lost the shoe, but now Healy was so frightened that he didn't care who he stepped on. He darted in the alley, skidding on the moss-slick concrete, and retrieved his bicycle. There wasn't enough room to ride it out, and hardly enough room to turn it around. He grabbed it by the handlebars, sawed and twisted it until he had maneuvered the front wheel forward, and then he ran it out where, to his horror, LaSharon Odom and the baby were standing on the sidewalk waiting for him. Healy froze. Languidly, she hiked the baby higher on her hip, looked at him. What she wanted from him, he had absolutely no idea, but yet he was afraid to say anything, and so he just stood there and looked back at her, heart galloping. After what seemed like forever, she reshifted the baby and said, "Let me have that funny book." Without a word, Healy reached in his back pocket and handed the comic over. Placidly, without a flicker of gratitude, she shifted the baby's weight to one arm and reached to take it, but before she could, the baby stretched out its arms and caught the comic book between his filthy little palms. With solemn eyes, he drew it close to his face and then tentatively closed his sticky, orange-stained mouth on it. Healy was revolted. It was one thing if she wanted to read the comic book. It was quite another if she wanted it for the baby to chew. LaSharon made no move to take the comic book away. Instead, she made goo-goo eyes at the baby and jogged it affectionately up and down, quite as if it was clean and attractive and not the roomy little wheezer it was. "Why did he crying?" she said to it brightly, in baby talk, peering directly into its tiny face. "Why did he crying back there?" Jesus Christ. And that's that for now.